There are moments in American industrial history when silence speaks louder than any press conference. Detroit has lived through those moments before, just before mass layoffs, before plants went dark, before entire chapters of manufacturing quietly came to an end. And now, once again, Detroit has gone unusually quiet. There were no ribbon cuttings, no optimistic announcements about new factories or future jobs, no confident speeches about American manufacturing roaring back. Instead, there was only absence, the kind that makes union leaders uneasy, investors alert, and industry analysts pay close attention. In the auto business, silence is never neutral. It usually means a decision has already been made behind closed doors. That decision came from General Motors. In the span of a single week, GM, a company that helped build the American middle class, did something Washington had long assumed it could prevent. It redirected $25 billion in investment north of the border, swiftly and decisively. Not after years of public negotiation, not with dramatic warnings, but with quiet filings, calculated timing, and finality. This is not simply a story about a multinational corporation chasing profit. It is a cold assessment of the policy environment in the United States. When a company born in Flint, Michigan, once the beating heart of American manufacturing, chooses to build its future elsewhere, the question is no longer what GM did. The question is what the United States failed to provide. Detroit's silence did not come out of nowhere. It was the product of months, even years, of accumulating uncertainty. And when that silence finally broke, it did not sound like a single corporate decision. It sounded like a warning, one aimed at the entire American industrial system. Long before the announcement stunned Detroit, the warning signs were already there, just not in headlines. For nearly 18 months, General Motors had been sending quiet signals that something fundamental was changing. No press releases, no speeches, just patterns that only industry insiders tend to notice. First came the pause. Planned U.S. facility expansions stopped appearing on investor briefings. Projects that were once described as next-generation anchors quietly slipped off timelines. Then came the meetings, closed-door conversations between GM executives and Canadian federal and provincial officials, conducted without fanfare and without leaks. At the same time, GM began hiring logistics and supply chain consultants with a very specific specialty: cross-border manufacturing. None of this was accidental. In the auto industry, capital planning happens years in advance. When a company the size of GM slows domestic announcements while deepening cross-border coordination, it usually means executives are running scenarios, not political scenarios, but financial ones. What would another 4 years of tariff volatility cost? How do unpredictable trade rules affect battery sourcing, EV pricing, and long-term profitability? What happens when regulatory signals change faster than factories can be built? By early this year, those internal models had converged on the same conclusion. Uncertainty itself had become the most expensive input, not wages, not materials, not even tariffs, but the inability to plan around them. And when a company that has survived wars, recessions, and oil shocks decides uncertainty is the risk it can no longer absorb, the decision that follows is rarely incremental. It is decisive. To outsiders, GM's move appeared sudden. To those watching closely, it was the final step in a process that had been unfolding quietly for months. A calculation made not in public statements, but in spreadsheets, forecasts, and boardroom silence. What made those signals especially alarming was their consistency. This wasn't a single hedge or a temporary slowdown tied to market conditions. It was a coordinated shift across planning, procurement, and personnel. Supplier contracts were quietly renegotiated with more flexible geographic clauses. Internal timelines stretched, then stopped. Capital that would normally be locked into U.S.-based projects was left deliberately uncommitted. Inside the company, executives weren't debating ideology. They were debating exposure. Electric vehicle production demands massive upfront investment, long construction windows, and stable rules that won't change midstream. Battery plants can't be paused and restarted without enormous losses. When policy becomes a moving target, every $1 billion at risk carries a multiplier. By mid-year, those internal conversations hardened. The question was no longer whether uncertainty could be managed, but whether it could be priced at all. Forecasts began to diverge wildly, depending on tariff scenarios announced one week and walked back the next. Risk officers flagged that volatility itself was now the dominant cost driver, eclipsing labor, energy, and even raw materials. This is the moment many outsiders miss. Corporations do not flee because conditions are difficult. They flee when conditions are unknowable. Difficulty can be planned for. Volatility cannot. So when observers later described GM's move as sudden, they misunderstood what they were seeing. The public announcement was fast. The decision behind it was anything but. It was the end point of 18 months of quiet recalculation, a recognition that waiting for clarity had become more dangerous than choosing a new direction. By the time the world noticed, the math was already settled. The only thing left was execution. Tariffs were not new to American industry. What was new, and ultimately intolerable, was how unpredictable they became. Under Donald Trump, trade policy stopped functioning as a framework and started behaving like a pressure tactic. Announcements arrived suddenly, timelines shifted without warning, and threats were floated publicly before being revised or delayed days later. For politicians, this volatility was leverage. For manufacturers, it was paralysis. Large-scale industrial investments do not respond to slogans or short-term political messaging. They respond to stable assumptions. A battery plant takes years to plan, permit, and build. Supply chains must be locked in long before the first machine is installed. When tariff policy can change overnight, or even be hinted at changing, those assumptions collapse. Inside GM, the problem wasn't the size of any single tariff. It was the inability to model the future. Financial teams could account for higher costs. They could not account for rules that shifted faster than capital projects could adapt. A tariff announced today but suspended tomorrow still destroys confidence because it signals that tomorrow's rules are unknowable. This is where Washington's strategy misfired. The administration believed that pressure would force compliance, that automakers would absorb uncertainty in exchange for access to the U.S. market. But global manufacturers are no longer captive to a single country. They have options. And when faced with chaos, they don't negotiate. They relocate. By the time new tariff threats were floated this spring, GM was no longer reacting emotionally or politically. It was responding rationally. The conclusion was stark. Uncertainty was no longer a temporary risk. It had become a permanent feature of the U.S. policy environment, and once that realization set in, the breaking point was inevitable. When the shift finally became visible, it happened with startling speed. Early Monday morning, analysts at Reuters noticed something unusual, a series of Canadian regulatory filings tied to General Motors that hadn't appeared in more than a decade. These weren't routine disclosures, they were the kind that signal a major capital commitment, the corporate equivalent of clearing your throat before making a historic announcement. By midweek, the picture snapped into focus. General Motors officially unveiled a $25 billion investment package in Ontario, the largest single automotive investment Canada has ever secured. The scope was sweeping and deliberate. A massive electric vehicle battery gigafactory in Windsor, a fully modernized assembly complex in Oshawa, a new research and development hub in Toronto focused on autonomous and next-generation vehicle technology. Just as significant as what was announced was who was not present. There were no U.S. government officials on stage, no joint statements, no symbolic nods to Washington. The announcement was made alongside Canadian federal and provincial leaders, and that absence spoke volumes. Within 48 hours, GM confirmed the other side of the equation. 3 planned U.S. facility expansions were paused indefinitely. Projects in Ohio, Tennessee, and Michigan once described as pillars of America's EV future, were suddenly placed on hold. Workers who had been promised jobs were left in limbo. Cities that had budgeted for growth were forced to reconsider everything. This was not a bluff. It was not a warning shot. It was execution. What made the moment so jarring was its precision. The announcement landed just days before the next round of proposed U.S. auto tariffs was set to be introduced. GM had moved first, locking in incentives, securing guarantees, and removing leverage before Washington could react. In one decisive week, years of industrial assumptions collapsed, and Detroit, watching in real time, realized this wasn't a negotiation anymore. It was a departure. Canada did not win this investment by accident, and it did not win it with rhetoric. It won by offering something increasingly rare in global manufacturing: certainty. While Washington relied on pressure and public loyalty tests, Canada presented GM with a complete, disciplined package. Provincial and federal incentives matched U.S. programs dollar for dollar. Tax credits were structured not as one-time political wins, but as long-term commitments. Environmental and trade rules were clearly defined, with assurances they would not be rewritten midstream. Most importantly, Canada put everything on a timeline GM could actually plan around. This was not about being cheaper. It was about being predictable. At the center of that strategy was Mark Carney, whose government framed the deal not as a raid on American jobs, but as a partnership built on stability. The message was simple and relentlessly consistent. Invest here, and the rules will not change without warning. For a company preparing to spend $25 billion over a decade, that message mattered more than any single subsidy. Canada also understood something Washington ignored. Modern auto manufacturing is not just about factories. It is about ecosystems. Workforce training agreements were baked into the deal. Cross-border supply chains were treated as assets, not threats. Regulatory alignment was promised in advance, not negotiated after the fact. The contrast was stark. Where the United States suggested compliance through pressure, Canada offered collaboration through policy. Where Washington spoke in terms of loyalty and punishment, Ottawa spoke in terms of contracts and planning horizons. GM didn't choose Canada out of ideology. It chose Canada because Canada reduced risk. In a world where capital moves at the speed of confidence, that distinction is decisive. This is the part of the story that makes policymakers uncomfortable. Canada didn't lure GM away with a better speech. It won by doing the unglamorous work of governance, and by proving that in the competition for global investment, predictability beats patriotism every time. Washington's reaction was immediate and deeply revealing. Within hours of the announcement, administration officials denounced General Motors as disloyal, short-sighted, and unpatriotic. Statements framed the move not as a response to policy failure, but as a betrayal of national values. The tone was sharp, defensive, and unmistakably angry. But anger is not a strategy. Rather than addressing the uncertainty that drove GM's decision, officials reached for threats. The Commerce Department floated reviews of GM's eligibility for future federal contracts. Treasury hinted at potential consequences for companies that abandon American workers. The president took to social media, attacking GM's leadership personally. None of it included a policy fix. None of it restored predictability. In fact, the response confirmed every concern GM had been quietly modeling for months. If the government's instinct was retaliation rather than reform, then uncertainty was not a temporary phase. It was structural. This is the critical miscalculation Washington made. Officials believed pressure would reassert control, that public shaming would force corporate compliance. But global manufacturers do not interpret pressure as strength. They interpret it as risk. And risk is exactly what GM had just spent 18 months trying to escape. Markets noticed. Investors understood the message clearly. The administration was reacting, not leading. When governments respond to capital flight with blame, it signals they have no tools left to stop it. That signal travels fast. Instead of reassuring other manufacturers, Washington's response unsettled them. If GM could be punished for making a rational decision, what would happen to the next company considering its options? By the end of the week, the damage was done. The administration had not reversed the decision. It had not offered a credible alternative. It had simply made one thing unmistakably clear. The environment GM left behind was not about to change. General Motors' decision did not occur in isolation, and it was never going to stay isolated. In the automotive industry, capital moves in patterns. When one major manufacturer successfully relocates investment without penalty, every other boardroom takes notice. Within days of GM's announcement, the signals began to ripple outward. Ford confirmed it was evaluating expanded electric truck production in Canada. Stellantis disclosed an additional multi-billion-dollar investment in its Ontario operations. Honda quietly increased its Canadian R&D budget, focusing on electric and autonomous vehicle development. None of these moves were framed as reactions to GM. That is precisely the point. In corporate decision-making, imitation is rarely explicit, but it is constant. This is how industrial shifts actually happen. One company proves a strategy works. Others test the same assumptions. What had once seemed risky suddenly looks rational. What had once seemed unthinkable becomes precedent. The Trump administration underestimated this dynamic. The belief was that tariffs would trap companies inside national borders, forcing domestic investment. But modern manufacturers are not trapped. They are global, modular, and mobile. Once a viable alternative is demonstrated, pressure loses its power. GM didn't just move money, it moved expectations. Executives across the auto sector began asking the same questions GM had already answered. Where can we plan 10 years ahead without policy reversals? Where are incentives tied to rules, not personalities? Where can we invest without waking up to a new trade threat on social media? Canada now had proof, not a promise, proof. And that is what makes the moment dangerous for the United States. Domino effects don't announce themselves loudly. They unfold quietly, investment by investment, until the pattern is undeniable. By the time policymakers realize what is happening, the decisions are already locked in. GM may not be the last company to leave. It may simply be the first that made it obvious. For Detroit, the impact was immediate and deeply personal. This was not an abstract policy debate or a distant balance sheet adjustment. It was projects frozen, timelines erased, and promises quietly withdrawn. In Detroit, the pause of planned expansions translated into something far more tangible. Jobs that were announced but never materialized, neighborhoods that prepared for growth now forced to brace for stagnation. Auto manufacturing has always been cyclical, and workers understand downturns. What is harder to accept is uncertainty without explanation. When investments are delayed indefinitely, families cannot plan. Apprenticeships stall. Local suppliers hesitate to hire. Cities that budgeted for tax revenue and infrastructure are left guessing. The damage compounds not in headlines, but in everyday decisions. Whether to buy a home, whether to stay, whether to leave. This is where policy failure becomes human. For generations, working at GM meant stability. It meant a middle-class life built on predictable wages, pensions, and the belief that loyalty ran both ways. When capital pulls back without a clear path forward, that social contract erodes. Not because companies have changed, but because the environment they operate in has. Washington often frames these outcomes as unfortunate side effects. Workers experience them as broken trust. The harsh reality is that uncertainty always extracts its price from those least able to absorb it. Executives can relocate, capital can redeploy, workers cannot. When industrial policy collapses into volatility, it is not think tanks that pay first. It is assembly lines, suppliers, and communities built around them. Detroit has survived reinvention before, but reinvention requires direction. What it cannot survive, what no industrial city can, is being left in limbo while decisions are made elsewhere, with no plan to bring certainty back home. What happened with General Motors was not a sudden betrayal, and it was not an isolated corporate gamble. It was the outcome of a competition that the United States failed to recognize in time. A competition not defined by speeches or patriotism, but by predictability, planning, and policy discipline. Canada understood the rules of that competition. It offered stability instead of spectacle, contracts instead of threats, and long-term certainty instead of shifting demands. The result was not just a $25 billion investment, but a powerful signal to global capital. This is a place where decisions can be made with confidence. The United States sent a very different message. It showed that industrial policy could change overnight, that loyalty might be tested publicly, and that retaliation could substitute for reform. For corporations tasked with deploying billions over decades, that message was decisive and deeply discouraging. This is the uncomfortable truth at the center of the story. Capital has no nationality, loyalty has limits, and uncertainty is always punished. When governments rely on pressure instead of policy, markets respond by moving elsewhere. What happens next is still unwritten. Washington could treat this moment as a warning, an opportunity to rebuild trust through clear rules, durable incentives, and a coherent industrial strategy. Or it could double down on volatility, assuming that threats can succeed where planning failed. General Motors has already made its choice. Canada has made its case. The question now is whether the United States understands what just happened. Because tonight, one thing is clear. America is losing a competition it didn't even know it was in. And the cost of that ignorance is being measured not in rhetoric, but in factories, jobs, and futures quietly built somewhere else.